They shoved an elderly black man in front of a full terminal, accused him of holding up the line, and questioned whether someone like him could even afford to fly first class. None of them knew who he really was, and by the time they realized, it was too late. This isn't just a story about racial profiling at the airport. It's a wake-up call wrapped in humiliation, silence, and a twist no one saw coming. What began as casual mockery turned into an unraveling of power, status, and justice at 35,000 feet. You won't believe how it ends, and neither did they. If stories of truth, accountability, and poetic justice speak to you, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what part of the story hit you hardest. Let's talk about what happens when judgment meets reality and why respect should never depend on appearances. Harold Simmons stepped through the glass doors of Terminal B just as the sun broke the horizon behind him, casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch across the polished floor ahead. Dressed in a pressed charcoal overcoat and polished Oxfords, he looked every bit the gentleman, but it wasn't long before he became something else. In their eyes, an inconvenience. He moved with purpose, albeit slowly, leaning gently on his cane with every other step. The crowd around him surged in waves. Businessmen with briefcases, young couples clutching passports, families managing strollers and snacks. Yet none of them seemed to notice the man who had already seen more of life than most of them ever would. His first stop was security, where a young TSA agent with tired eyes and a rigid posture motioned him forward with barely veiled impatience. He placed his coat, shoes, and belt into the tray and stepped through the scanner with quiet compliance. The agent squinted at the screen and waved another officer over. Without explanation, they pulled Harold's tray aside and began opening every item like they expected to find something dangerous inside his glasses case or prescription bottles. The younger one asked if he had any sharp metal objects, and Harold calmly replied that he had a hip replacement, as indicated on. Still, they waved a wand over every inch of him, as if something about his skin, his age, or his calm demeanor made him suspicious. Meanwhile, a white teenager wearing headphones and a hoodie passed straight through without being stopped, so despite the fact he hadn't even removed his watch, Harold noticed. So did others. But no one said anything. When they were finally done, they handed his items back without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a look that suggested he should be grateful he was allowed to proceed at all. He didn't speak, didn't shake his head. He simply gathered his belongings with quiet dignity and made his way toward his gate. There, the check-in counter bustled with life, and Harold waited in line like everyone else. But when his turn came, the attendant's expression changed. Her smile faltered as she looked at his name and then back at his face. After typing on the keyboard for a moment, she frowned and told him his assigned seat had been changed. She didn't explain why, only that there had been a last-minute reassignment. He mentioned that he had paid for extra legroom seat 4A, near the front, but she said nothing more than it was a system update. No seat preference honored, no concern offered. A younger white man in a designer tracksuit approached next, laughing into his phone, and was greeted with a wide smile. He received his ticket and was waved along with a compliment on his sneakers. Harold, meanwhile, was handed a new seat. He thanked her out of habit, not sincerity, then walked slowly toward the gate with ticket in hand and thoughts heavy behind his quiet gaze. Boarding began. Harold waited at the rear of the priority line, though his ticket allowed him early entry. When he stepped forward, a flight attendant held up a hand and asked him to wait. She claimed there was a minor delay in scanning his pass. As she fumbled with the handheld device, the woman behind Harold stood there, silent, a half step from the entrance, watching each new passenger breeze by while he was told again and again to wait just one more moment. Eventually, the scanner beeped green, and he was allowed on board. The aisle was narrow, and the passengers already seated made no effort to move as he made his way toward the back. He brushed elbows and ducked under overhead bins, gripping his cane tightly. By the time he reached his row, someone had already placed their bag where his should go. No one offered help. He waited until a flight attendant passed and asked softly for assistance. She looked surprised, almost annoyed, but lifted the bag without a word. As Harold sat down, knees cramped and shoulders stiff, he stared at the faded safety pamphlet in the seat pocket. He said nothing, but he felt everything. Every glance, every small injustice disguised as protocol. He wasn't offended anymore, not by the glances, not by the tension in a seatmate's shoulders when he sat beside them. But this time, there was something else in the air. He could feel it building. His reassignment wasn't just a clerical mistake. It had been deliberate, and now every new interaction confirmed that fact. Just before the aircraft doors closed, a flight attendant approached Harold with a handheld scanner in one hand and a polite but forced smile on her face. She asked for his boarding pass again, claiming there was one last verification. Harold handed it over wordlessly, watching her hesitate as she tapped at the screen. She muttered something about a discrepancy in the record, and then asked him to follow her to the galley. Passengers shifted to let him pass, eyes following as he walked back down the aisle he'd just fought through to enter. At the rear of the plane, beside the humming coffee maker and stacks of beverage carts, 2 other attendants waited, one of whom glanced him over from head to toe and asked if he'd perhaps checked into the wrong flight. Harold calmly stated his flight number seat. They nodded and told him there was confusion about his identity that needed to be resolved with a supervisor at the front of the plane. The walk back, through the cabin now full of settled passengers, was twice as humiliating as the first, but Harold didn't lower his eyes. He moved slowly, not from embarrassment but from something colder, steady. At the front galley, he was met by the gate supervisor, a tall man with slicked hair and a badge that hung too tightly on his lanyard. The supervisor asked Harold for his ID again and began typing on a tablet. Moments passed. The plane still hadn't pushed back from the gate. Then came the first cut. A passing flight attendant, one of the younger ones with too much perfume and too little patience, leaned in and whispered loudly enough to be heard. He couldn't even work the check-in screen. Took him 5 whole minutes just to hit confirm. Another attendant chuckled. I'm surprised he even knew how to scan his ID. Probably thought the machine was broken. The joke wasn't just cruel. It was meant to dehumanize. It turned Harold from a paying passenger into an inconvenience, and worse, into entertainment. Behind the curtain separating first class from the front galley, Harold could hear passengers laughing. The context was unclear, but the tone was not. A man's voice piped up from within the cabin, mocking the idea that someone like Harold would have purchased a premium seat. What next, he said. We hand out champagne to anyone with a social security check? Harold remained still. He didn't ask to be defended. He didn't argue. He simply stood there as the gate supervisor cleared his throat and stated, a bit louder than necessary, that the system appeared to be in order after all. You may return to your seat, the man said, but the damage was already done. Harold didn't respond. He turned, retracing his steps again through the narrow aisle, where eyes darted away just fast enough to avoid direct confrontation. A teenage girl looked up from her phone as he passed and giggled. Her mother leaned over to whisper something behind her hand, and Harold heard it clearly. In row 14, a businessman with silver cufflinks made a sarcastic remark to his colleague about people who didn't belong flying if they couldn't even find the right row without assistance. Harold finally reached his seat again, shoulders stiff from the long walk, his knees protesting each bend as he lowered himself back down. He noticed his cane had been knocked sideways beneath the seat in front of him. No one nearby had offered to move it back. He bent down, retrieved it carefully, and straightened the collar of his coat before sitting upright. The plane began to taxi, and the hum of the engine filled the cabin like white noise, if any. He replayed everything. The insult at the gate, the ridicule in the galley, the empty stares of passengers who watched but never questioned. The humiliation clung to him like static. Then, less than an hour into the flight, a new humiliation arrived. A flight attendant reappeared, clipboard in hand and a tight smile across her face. She leaned down, her voice coated with false professionalism, and told Harold there had been a clerical error. He blinked, waiting. The attendant informed him that his original ticket had in fact been assigned to a premium seat, row 4A, but due to what she called a security update, his presence in economy would be required for the remainder of the flight. Harold, in a steady tone, calmly explained that he had booked 4A weeks prior, that his confirmation email matched the itinerary, that nothing in his plans had changed. He asked what exactly had triggered the reassignment. Her smile didn't waver. It's just protocol, she said, before hurrying away. Harold's brow tightened. Something had shifted again, not only in location but in tone. 15 minutes passed, Then 3 airline employees approached from the front cabin. All wore dark uniforms, earpieces, and government-issued badges. They stopped beside him without introduction. One stood directly in front of Harold's knees, another angled behind his shoulder. The third leaned in from the aisle and whispered something Harold couldn't hear. A passenger across from him raised his phone slightly, pretending to scroll but clearly filming. One of the agents lowered his voice and asked Harold to confirm his name, date of birth, and reason for travel. Harold complied, clear and concise. The questions continued. Had he accepted any items from strangers? Had he deviated from his original boarding plan? Had he recently changed addresses or adjusted travel details last minute? Each question felt less like a routine inquiry and more like a subtle accusation. Around him, the passengers stopped pretending to ignore it. A woman to his left muttered something under her breath. A child leaned into the aisle to see better. The agent repeated a question about Harold's connection to the city he was landing in, then asked him to show his ID again. Despite already verifying it during boarding, Harold reached for his coat pocket, pulled out the ID and handed it over with steady fingers. His jaw was set. He knew what this was. Not a random check, not a mistake. It was a message. They stepped back and conferred in low voices, nodding to one another as if assessing a threat level. After a few more tense minutes, they returned his ID and said, almost casually, "We'll be monitoring for the remainder of the flight. We appreciate your cooperation." Harold didn't respond. He didn't look away. They left as quietly as they'd come, but the attention didn't follow them. It remained on him. For the next hour, he felt it press in from every direction. The sense that he had been branded by their presence turned into a spectacle of suspicion, that the plane itself had decided he no longer belonged among them, even as a passenger. Later, when the snack service arrived, his tray was skipped. No one said anything. No one offered an apology or a correction. Harold simply sat back, his hands resting calmly on his lap, and stared out the window, not at the clouds but at the reflection. The pressure in the cabin was nothing compared to the pressure building inside his chest. Not anger, but endurance stretched thin across decades of practiced silence. When the announcement finally came that the plane would begin its descent, passengers stirred awake, buckled seatbelts, adjusted jackets, and re-engaged. With the world as if the last 2 hours had simply been a pause in their busy lives, for Harold, every moment had been magnified. And as the plane landed, as the wheels screeched across the tarmac and as rows began rising from their seats, the choreography of injustice moved into its next act. The flight crew began directing passengers toward the front exit, and Harold, last row by assignment, waited patiently as the crowd inched forward. When it was finally his turn to rise, the man seated behind him exhaled loudly and muttered about how slow people were. Harold didn't respond. He stood, straightened his coat, and began the awkward walk down the aisle with his cane held close, his bag in hand. It was when he reached the narrowest section, just before the front galley, that it happened. A uniformed airline employee, waiting at the front to usher people along, turned toward Harold and placed one hand firmly on his shoulder, not to assist but to move him. The touch was not gentle. It was a shove disguised as urgency, a hand that didn't pause to ask but pushed to command. Harold stumbled slightly, catching his balance against the wall with the side of his foot twisting slightly beneath him. He looked up, expression flat, breath even. The employee looked past him as if nothing had occurred. Passengers witnessed it. A few blinked. One woman gasped audibly. No one intervened. Harold collected himself and continued down the ramp, shoulders squared, steps steady. But what he didn't hear, at first, was the voice behind him. A child's voice, small but sharp, cutting through the silence. Why did he push that man like that, Mommy? Was he in trouble? A hush followed. The child's mother, clearly unsettled, whispered something quickly, trying to soothe or distract, but the words had landed. Eyes turned not toward Harold but toward the man who had touched him. Even then, no apology came. Just avoidance. Just silence. Just the dry voice of another staff member announcing the connecting gate numbers over a scratchy intercom, trying to shift attention away. The terminal smelled of cleaning solution and cold coffee as Harold walked slowly toward the baggage claim area, gripping his cane with renewed pressure. His hip still ached from the pressure of the stumble. His dignity remained intact, But it had taken another blow. Each step forward was like walking through thick fog. Not from confusion, but from clarity, because everything had become visible now. There were no more masks, no more attempts to pretend. What began at the scanner had become something else entirely. A campaign of discrediting, a slow erosion of worth by subtle force. His seat, his service, his place in line, and now his personal space. All had been compromised, all taken as if he didn't have the right to possess them. And yet he moved forward. No one stopped him to ask if he was all right. No employee offered water. No agent explained why a man of his age and stature had been shoved like an object to be filed away. But the memory of that child's voice lingered. That voice, unfiltered by cynicism, unprotected by protocol, had seen something others chose not to name. Harold thought of it as he passed Gate 11, as he stepped into the glow of the arrival hall. The child's voice still echoed in his mind as he made his way to the next gate for his connecting flight, a quieter, regional hop to a smaller city, where he would finally deliver the legal papers from his late brother's estate. He was early, again, by design. He preferred silence before flight. But when he approached the podium for check-in, the woman in uniform standing behind the desk barely looked up. She was in her 30s, blonde hair pinned tightly back, lips pressed into a line that had no intention of curving upward. She offered bright smiles and soft gestures to the couple ahead of him, even leaned slightly to wish them a safe journey. But when Harold stepped forward, her demeanor changed like a switch had been flipped. Without a greeting, she reached for his ID and boarding pass, scanned them, and returned them without a word. No, enjoy your flight. No, thank you, Mr. Simmons. Just silence and the subtle downward flick of her eyes as if deciding she'd seen all she needed to. Harold took the pass, stepped aside, and found a seat near the window of the waiting area. He sat with poise, upright, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon, his thoughts heavy. But when boarding began 30 minutes later, the agent called zones with a cheerful tone that made Harold's own boarding group one. Inside the smaller aircraft, the cabin was colder. The overhead bins were nearly full, and Harold quietly placed his bag beneath the seat, careful not to block the aisle. He eased down into the leather seat slowly, his joints resisting the angle, and reached for the seatbelt. It had slipped between the cushions, twisted into an awkward knot. He leaned sideways, trying to retrieve it, but his shoulder caught against the armrest, and the belt wouldn't budge. Across the aisle, a woman glanced his way but turned back to her phone without offering help. Then, a flight attendant came down the aisle, checking overhead latches. She noticed Harold's struggle, her gaze falling directly on his hand as he tried to free the belt. For a moment, it seemed she might stop. But she didn't. She walked past without slowing, without saying a word, her heels clicking decisively on the floor, her attention reserved for the passengers in rows ahead, who greeted her warmly and received warm greetings in return. Harold finally managed to untangle the belt on his own. He locked it into place and folded his hands across his lap, feeling not shame, but something worse, dismissal. The kind of disregard that tells a person they are not merely invisible but undeserving of notice. Later, during the beverage service, he was skipped. Not forgotten, skipped. The cart stopped behind him, then in front of him, but not at his row. He raised a finger briefly, then lowered it. No one looked back. The woman beside him didn't speak. The flight was less than 2 hours, but it felt like another layer being peeled away, one thin act at a time. Not dramatic, not loud, just enough to sting, just enough to remind him that to some, his presence was not offensive. It was irrelevant. He had one final connection, his last flight of the journey, and he already knew what to expect. As he made his way toward the final gate, a sharp voice behind him startled the quiet, belonging to a man in his 20s, holding up a smartphone, filming as he spoke into the lens. "This man right here has been disrespected the entire trip," he said, panning the camera toward Harold as he moved. "And I want people to see how a veteran gets treated in first class." Harold kept walking, neither acknowledging nor objecting, but others nearby turned to watch. Within minutes, 2 employees approached the man with the camera, both dressed in Navy uniforms with security patches on their sleeves. They asked him to put the phone away, citing rules about protecting the privacy of airline staff. When he resisted and insisted that passengers had a right to document injustice, they threatened to remove him from the terminal. The phone disappeared into his pocket, but the damage had been done. People had noticed. Not just Harold, not just the camera, but the silence that followed. The boarding call began soon after, and Harold presented his ticket at the front of the line. The agent paused, squinted at the boarding pass, then at Harold, and whispered something into her headset. Moments later, a supervisor arrived, a stern-faced man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and a badge clipped to his breast pocket. The supervisor gestured for Harold to step aside. He didn't argue. The conversation was low, but passengers nearby could still hear it. The man asked Harold for a second form of identification, something beyond a driver's license. Harold complied without flinching. Then came the final blow. "Sir," the supervisor said, eyes narrow and voice tight, "we've had passengers abuse elite access recently. We need to verify you didn't get this seat through a loophole or unauthorized upgrade." The sentence hung in the air like a slap. He didn't say race, he didn't say class, but the implication was unmistakable. Harold Simmons, dressed modestly, standing calmly with ticket in hand and name verified in multiple systems, was being accused of impersonating the type of person who belonged there. His posture didn't change. He handed over the requested documents. But the supervisor didn't apologize, didn't explain, didn't offer help. He stepped away after glancing once more at Harold's face, as if trying to reconcile the idea of worth with the reality before him. When Harold finally boarded, the looks he received weren't curious anymore. They were suspicious, like he had passed a security check that others hadn't known existed. In his assigned seat near the front, he placed his bag beneath the chair, adjusted the armrest, and sat with folded hands as the aisle filled. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands. A man 2 rows behind spoke in a low voice to his companion. "They're really letting anyone up here now." It wasn't the volume that mattered. It was the intent, the deliberate softness designed to be heard by the exact person being talked about. No one corrected him, no one defended. One flight attendant walked by, nodded at everyone in the row, and skipped Harold entirely. Another passed drinks and offered options to the aisle and window seats, leaving Harold untouched in the center. As the plane taxied to position, the weight of the day settled into Harold's chest. Not just the interactions, but the invisible burden of navigating a world that demanded both silence and proof from him at every turn. He had complied with every instructions, obeyed every request, offered no resistance, and still at every checkpoint had been asked to explain himself, to justify his presence. After hours of being dismissed, poked at, second-guessed, and silently condemned, there was no more room left for doubt. He was not welcome in the space he had rightfully paid to be in. And still, he had remained composed. Still, he had said nothing. But now, as the sun dipped beyond the glass walls of the terminal, casting long reflections across the floor, something shifted in the stillness of his body. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a black phone, unlike the one he'd used earlier. A model not sold in stores, one with no apps and no camera. Just a keypad and a signal that didn't rely on commercial towers. He pressed a single digit. The call didn't ring. It connected. His voice was low and calm, but what he said was not casual. "I need confirmation at Concourse C. Full protocol." He ended the call, returned the phone to his pocket, and waited. 5 minutes passed, 6. Then something changed. The murmurs at the gate began to fade. People turned toward the entrance of the terminal, where a black stretch limousine, glossy even beneath airport dust, pulled up at the curb outside. A chauffeur in dark gray livery and white gloves stepped out and opened the rear passenger door, speaking briefly to the attendant at the information desk. Moments later, 2 senior managers appeared from the restricted area. Not Harold Simmons, the man who had endured hours of humiliation, but Jeremiah Coleman. The name moved quietly through the nearest staff member's lips like a prayer or a warning. The younger security agent's eyes widened as he pulled up a tablet and tapped quickly through a personnel access system. His hand trembled slightly as he tilted the screen toward the flight manager. The screen displayed a photo of a younger man, darker hair but the same steady eyes, the same jawline, the same silent composure. The name beneath read, Jeremiah Elias Coleman, Chairman Coleman Winters Foundation, Principal Stakeholder, Stratford Financial Holdings. A single glance at the corporate history tied to his name revealed more than any uniform or boarding pass could ever suggest. The man sitting quietly by the column wasn't a lost passenger. He was the architect of funding structures that had built hospitals, tech campuses, and 2 entire airport terminals, including the very one they stood in. Jeremiah rose slowly, his movements as unhurried as they had been all day, and approached the counter where 4 employees now stood, stiffly, unsure whether to speak or to move. Behind him, other passengers began to move, sensing a shift in the air, though they couldn't name it. One of the managers leaned forward and asked if there had been a mistake. Jeremiah didn't respond. He placed a business card on the counter, not one printed for mass distribution, but engraved in minimalist font, the kind given only in critical moments. The younger security agent reached for it with shaking fingers, eyes darting between the card and the screen he still held. The flight manager swallowed hard and took a step back. No apology was offered. It was already too late for that. The limousine waited just outside, the driver holding the door open with quiet formality. Jeremiah turned. Not toward the exit, but toward the nearest window, where the lights of the tarmac shimmered like reflections on a disturbed lake. He looked over the terminal floor, past the faces that had ignored him, dismissed him, insulted him. No expression crossed his face. He simply watched, and in that moment, silence swept the gate more effectively than any announcement. A senior airport liaison, summoned minutes earlier, attempted to catch pace beside him, stammering about protocol, guest services, miscommunication, and isolated error. But Jeremiah neither answered nor acknowledged. He passed through security access doors that required no explanations, led not by guidance but by authority, the authority that comes not from noise but from foundation, not from power declared but from power known. In a private lounge shielded from the chaos outside, he sat for the first time without being questioned, without being measured, and retrieved a second phone from his coat. This one did not require introduction. The call was short, a single sentence delivered in full clarity. Pull every dime from the current terminal partnership, immediate freeze, send the notice in writing, and prepare the board for public release. Outside, the ripple effect began instantly. First in the financial department of the airport's corporate partners, where a digital alert hit an executive inbox worker. Within 45 minutes, it was drawn quickly by the adverse sent messages responsible for over 40%. It was confirmed that the infrastructure funding in the airport's current fiscal cycle had initiated an immediate divestment. Next came the press release, drafted and signed within the hour, issued not from the PR division of the airport, but from Coleman's legal team. It detailed in formal, unambiguous language the breach of trust, the failure of cultural accountability, and the withdrawal of institutional support until systemic reform could be demonstrated. As it made its way into the hands of media outlets, the footage began to surface. The clips from a bystander's live recording showing Harold being questioned, walked past, ignored, shoved. No violence, no raised voices, just the cold precision of institutional disdain, captured in full HD and streamed now across multiple platforms. One frame showed a child looking up in confusion as Harold steadied himself after being put. That image became the header. Financial analysts were the first to react, issuing warnings about reputational exposure. Shareholders, by noon, had seen stocks drop by 5%. By the end of day, double digits. The term, silent billion-dollar protest trended online. At the terminal, operations slowed. Staff began to speak in hushed voices. Word had traveled faster than expected, not because of Jeremiah's status, but because the world had seen this pattern before. And now, it had a name, a face, a billionaire with receipts. The cumula which Jeremiah had been denied service now hung in limbo, its funding source pulled, its leadership frozen in place waiting for legal fallout, its partners distancing themselves with sudden urgency. But Jeremiah hadn't left the building. He remained in the executive wing, not hiding, not avoiding the confrontation, but watching the system reckon with itself from within. Throughout the afternoon, requests came for meetings, urgent, last minute. Apologetic, he denied all of them. Instead, he sent a single public message, The statement was picked up by every major network before the sun had set. By evening, comment sections were flooded. Former employees of the airport came forward anonymously, describing similar stories of passive discrimination and unseen bias. What had been Harold Simmons, a forgotten figure, had become Jeremiah Coleman, a man who didn't shout but simply withdrew. And the silence was louder than protest. The limo waited again outside, just as before, but this time with press lining the sidewalk. Jeremiah didn't exit through the side. He stepped through the main concourse, past the same gate where he had once been ignored, past the desk where he'd been told to wait, past the floor where he had been shoved without a glance back. No one stopped him now. No one dared. A flight manager approached hesitantly, papers in hand, sweat on his brow, offering compensation, an apology, upgraded access for life. Jeremiah paused, glanced once at the man, then stepped into the sunlight without a word. At the heart of the media storm stood the airport's executive board, once confident in their polished branding and strategic partnerships, now scrambling to contain a crisis they could no longer spin. Within the first day, the board convened in an emergency session behind closed doors, but internal leaks rendered secrecy useless. The public demanded answers. Footage had gone viral. The child's voice in the background, asking why the man had been replayed millions of times, dissected by commentators, turned into hashtags, stitched into reels, and remixed into protest videos. Silence was no longer an option. By day 4, the airport's managing director stood before a press podium with trembling hands, reading from a statement that had gone through 10 drafts in 3 hours. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed panic. He used all the expected words: miscommunication, unfortunate incident, commitment to improvement, zero tolerance. But everyone watching knew what it was. It was a surrender, not a strategy. Behind him, 4 senior managers were no longer employed, their names removed from official directories, their access badges voided, their signatures stripped from internal memos. Among them was the shift supervisor who had questioned Jeremiah's eligibility to fly, the gate manager who had authorized the security intervention, and the flight attendants identified by passengers for acts of neglect and overt contempt. None were offered exit statements, none were defended. They were erased with the same quiet precision with which they had once erased the dignity of a man they thought invisible. But the consequences did not end with corporate embarrassment or administrative reshuffling. Civil rights organizations began filing independent investigations, citing not just the incident, but the broader pattern it reflected. Within days, federal inquiries were opened into the operational culture of the airport's leadership, particularly around discrimination in questioning and service denial based on profiling. One attorney general announced publicly that her office would be exploring charges related to civil rights violations, referencing existing legislation designed to hold transportation authorities accountable. Several employees were subpoenaed. Internal emails were requested. One staff member, previously anonymous, was placed under official investigation after his private group chat leaked. It became clear this wasn't a singular failure. It was a structure built to conceal one. Airline partners responded swiftly, not from moral outrage, but from market instinct. 2 major carriers issued statements distancing themselves from the incident, placing blame squarely on ground operations and third-party vendors. Contracts were reviewed, support was withdrawn. One executive, speaking off record, called it the costliest attitude problem in modern aviation history. But for those who had laughed, who had watched silently, who had whispered and scorned, and gone home proud of how they maintained order, the cost was more personal. One former agent, now dismissed, was served a lawsuit while sitting in a parking lot with his lunch still warm. Another, whose smirk had been captured on video, woke to a knock on her apartment door and a notice to appear in court. No one arrived with violence. No one shouted. The reckoning came, like Harold himself, with silence and certainty. What began with a man standing quietly at a boarding gate had ended with an industry realigned. It was not chaos, it was consequence. Jeremiah Coleman never returned to the airport during this process. He never appeared on television. He never tweeted. But every boardroom where his name had once meant growth now carried it like a warning. Respect is not earned after the fact. It is owed in every moment, every glance, every decision made when no one is watching. They had forgotten that. Now they remembered. Months passed like slow tides reshaping the shoreline after a violent storm. The headlines faded from front pages. The outrage that had once crackled across social feeds began to dim. But beneath the silence, something rare had begun to take root. The airport, now operating under new leadership and oversight, had introduced sweeping reforms on internal bias training, passenger treatment protocols, and ethics-based evaluations. But the deeper transformation occurred not on paper, not in press releases, but in the lives of those who had once stood on the wrong side of silence. Rebecca Hart, the flight attendant who had refused to acknowledge Harold as she passed his row, returned to public life under scrutiny, stripped of her rank, her license suspended. She disappeared from view for a time, until one morning she walked into the administrative office of the Coleman Winters Foundation, hands shaking as she filled out the volunteer intake form. She had read every word of the foundation's mission statement, studied the history of the man she once ignored, and submitted herself to the work without expectation. For 3 months she did nothing but file grant applications and refill copy paper, but she never asked for recognitions. It wasn't until the end of her 4th month that she requested to meet the man whose presence had quietly upended her own. The meeting, brief and unscheduled, took place in a small conference room filled with natural light. She apologized, not with grand gestures, but with a voice that barely held steady. He listened without nodding, without interrupting until she finished. He did not absolve her, but he acknowledged her growth, and that was enough to make her cry for the first time since her dismissal. She stayed with the foundation for another year, eventually leading a scholarship fund for aviation students from underrepresented communities. Her work slow, intentional, and genuine. Others followed, some quietly, some publicly. Marcus Hale, the security agent who had questioned Jeremiah's right to board, was ordered to attend court-mandated sensitivity training as part of a deferred penalty agreement. He emerged changed. Instead, he returned to the airport, not as an enforcer, but as part of a new passenger support initiative designed to de-escalate conflict and ensure fair treatment at every touchpoint. On his first day back, he stood beside a nervous elderly man unsure how to use the check-in kiosk. "Take your time," Marcus said, steady and patient, no rush. The moment passed without cameras, without applause, but it was real, small, but real. By the first anniversary of the incident, the terminal, once tainted by humiliation, had become the host of something unexpected. A campaign called Grounded in Justice, led not by outside consultants but by former employees who had witnessed or participated in the injustice and stayed to make it right. They hosted workshops, built policy templates, partnered with advocacy groups, and opened space for passengers and staff to report incidents without fear. Jeremiah Coleman declined every invitation to attend. His name did not appear in the promotional materials. But at the center of the terminal, in a newly built quiet space called the Reflection Room, a plaque was mounted without ceremony. It read, "Dignity begins where judgment ends. Let this be the place where respect always boards first." It was not about branding. It was not about redemption. It was about remembering what had been forgotten. At his home, far from the noise of terminals and flashbulbs, Jeremiah sat on a quiet porch overlooking a river he once fished as a boy. The phone beside him buzzed with news alerts and foundation updates. But he didn't reach for it. He watched the water bend around the rocks and disappear into the trees. He had not planned to become a symbol, but sometimes a man simply needs to take a walk through a broken system to remind it who builds the ground it stands on. And when that walk is finished, when the echo of his footsteps forces others to pause, that is enough. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives that uncover truth and justice in unexpected places. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment in the story struck you the hardest? Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about what respect, dignity, and real change mean to you.